This is the On Humans podcast with your host, Ilari and Nagel. Before jumping into today's episode, I wanted to take a short time for the first time to address you, the listeners, directly. It has been 2 months since I published On Humans, and since then a beautiful number of you from 78 countries have tuned in. This has been a real joy to witness. But it would be an even greater joy to hear from some of you directly. What have you enjoyed most? Have I screwed up something? And what kind of topics would you like to see covered in the future? Feel free to email me with an answer to these or any other similar questions at makela.ilari@outlook.com or use the podcast website to drop me a line. I promise to respond to every message I receive. This said, it has happened that a listener has messaged me with an invalid email in the submission form, which naturally makes the response impossible. So if you did reach out but did not hear back, then please just do it again and double check your address. But whether you decide to email or not, please know that I appreciate your attention greatly and will do my best to serve it well now and in the future. So thank you as always for listening. Let's go to today's show. Today's episode is the second part of my conversation with Gregory Berns. The first half of our discussion was published separately in episode number 4. Don't worry if you haven't listened to that, the topics are independent of each other. This one is about animal neuroscience. And while being mainly about dogs, our discussion goes much deeper than the peculiarities of these lovely canines. Doing animal neuroscience, Berns has had to confront the very question about how much can we know about what it's like to be another animal? Is attributing human-like emotions to non-human animals a dangerous form of anthropomorphism? Or is the opposite more dangerous? Is it overly human-centric to assume that we and only we can feel anger, rage, joy, and love? And if we do assume that non-human animals can have rich emotional lives, then how do we live with all the contradictions that emerge from the way we treat different animals? Like my earlier episode with Berns, this is a discussion with few definite answers, but many interesting explorations. This said, there is, for the first time, also an actual recommendation, which you will hear if you listen to the show to the very end after the conversation. Anyway, I hope that you enjoy the conversation, and I bring to you Gregory Berns.
Do you have a dog?
I don't, but I would like to. My grandfather just passed away this year, and he, together with my grandmother who passed away over a decade ago, they had wonderful dogs that were my childhood dogs.
Yeah, what kind of dogs?
Labradors. Great playmates. You have quite a few, right?
I do. We just actually lost one this weekend, so we're down to 3. Yeah.
Oh, I'm sorry. Who was it?
Well, this was a recent addition since I moved to the farm. This was a dog who wandered onto the farm about 6 months ago. I named her Ripple after the Grateful Dead song. Very sweet dog, but we also called her the tumor with a dog attached to it.
Oh, I see.
Because she had this softball-sized tumor on her leg. And so we knew she did not have much time left on Earth. And so we just gave her a nice home. So she passed on. But let's not dwell on dead dogs.
Well, we will, because I want to ask you about Newton. You start your book, How Do Dogs Love Us, with a story about your late dog Newton.
Yes.
Which started a long pioneering project in animal neuroscience. Would you like to tell the story one more time? I'm sure you told it many times.
Sure. I mean, Newton was a pug. He was the first dog that my wife and I got essentially as adults. So after I got out of training and, we finally, were settled enough and, had a place with a yard and big enough, we got Newton. And that was back in the 90s, I guess. So he was my first dog as an adult. Of course, I grew up with dogs, so I have, like childhood memories of those dogs, also retrievers. So over the years, Newton lived to be almost 15. I was very attached to him. And so when he passed away, I grieved him. Pet grief is real and in many ways more intense than we grieve for humans. I began to wonder whether, what his feelings were toward me. Was this relationship I had with him for 15 years, was that entirely based on food, the fact that I fed him and gave him treats, or was there something reciprocated in the sense that he had anything close to the feelings that I had for him? And for lack of a better word, call it love. And so that was the beginning of what then I called the Dog Project.
There's I guess, two kinds of philosophical traditions that pushed against you. First, there was the Cartesian idea. I'm sure René Descartes gets a lot of crap nowadays for everything. I'm sure he's not the only one, but he did claim that dogs are, or not, or that all non-human animals are automatons,
Right.
some kind of lifeless, selfless, emotionless, feelingless machines. Then there is another very different philosophical tradition that pushed against you, which relates to Thomas Nagel's famous paper, What is it like to be a bat?
Yes.
Where Nagel argues that we cannot know. Nagel, I don't think is Cartesian at all. I think he very explicitly believes that there is something that it is like to be a bat. There are feelings, there is a bat consciousness, but that we cannot know about it by the means of neuroscience, at least.
Right.
That no matter what we know about bat physiology, we won't know what it's like to be a bat, in the same sense as a colorblind person might know a lot about color vision, but they don't know what it's like to see red.
Right. And then in between those two, of course, is Jeremy Bentham, who said that the question wasn't whether animals can feel pain, but can they suffer?
Well, not whether animals can think, but whether they can suffer.
Yes.
Yeah. And before we get into your research, can you help me get a charitable view on the more moderate versions of not quite a Cartesian opinion, but there are people who seem to be still quite skeptical about animal emotions, animal feelings, who say that almost like, it's inherently problematic to assume that animals have emotions because it's anthropomorphizing, or saying that emotions are so related to language that animals without human style language couldn't have them. I don't know. Maybe I'm being too sentimental, but having played with dogs when I was young, it's pretty clear that they have some feelings, even if they wouldn't have our feelings.
Yeah. Well, okay, humans are not a paragon of consistency to begin with. So, I think most people, anyone who's lived with a dog or a cat, which is probably the majority of people.
At least the majority of people listening to this.
Yeah. I mean, after I started publishing on dog neuroscience, I mean, a lot of the reaction I got was, well, duh, obviously, obviously my dog loves me.
Yeah.
I didn't need an MRI to know that.
Yes.
So there's this common sense feeling that there's some emotions going on there. But then, of course, we eat animals. Most people do. And so how are you to jibe those two views of animals? Is there something special about dogs that's different than, say, a cow? In my view, there isn't. And now I say that with some authority as someone who now has a small herd of cows. But, if you go back to Darwin, in his book, The Expression of Emotions in Man and Animals, very clearly thought that emotions were also subject to evolutionary pressures, and there exists this continuum from humans into all animals, that human emotions just didn't arrive de novo. They came from something else, right?
Yeah. Let's get back to the point about cows. I think it raises, and speciesism more generally, it raises a lot of questions, but focusing first on the data. So a lot of the, as you said, the responses were like, well, duh, of course, my dogs love us. What was the data that they were responding to? One of the things that stuck with me was, do I remember this correctly, that after this long and very difficult training program of getting dogs to be in these MRI machines voluntarily, which was great, one of these things that you found was that when one of your dogs was in the scanner and the dog being able to get a whiff of their owner, so your wife's smell, got a strong reward response to this. Was that correct?
That's right. That's right. And then later on, we did kind of, I think, more fine-tuned studies where we examined the reward response to the prospect of food versus the prospect of verbal praise. Again, focusing on the reward system, and found that the majority, roughly 3/4 of the dogs that we studied, had equal responses to the prospect of praise, and some even had a greater prospect to that, greater response to
Yeah.
that. So it wasn't just the food.
Yeah.
Now we get back to the anthropomorphizing problem and interpreting that. Does that mean that they are feeling love? It's like, well, no, obviously not. Um, but this brings up kind of where I wanted to go back to my bone to pick with Nagel, no pun intended. So Nagel's argument was essentially that an animal's physiology is so different than the humans that we can't possibly know what it's going to be like to experience being in their bodies, right? And therefore, we can't say anything about what their emotions are if we can't even know what it's like for them to perceive the world. I disagree with that. I think actually we have a pretty good idea of what it's like to be many animals. And this is for two reasons. One is evolutionary continuity, especially among mammals, right? So a bat is a mammal, as are dogs. We share a common evolutionary history that means that our brains are fairly similar. They're not that different. All the same basic structures are there. Even our bodies are similar in many ways, right? We all have 4 limbs. Everyone essentially has 5 digits, give or take. The physiology is the same. We're mammals, so we bear live young. All these similarities mean that there are far more things in common than different, even with a bat. So yes, I think we actually can have a pretty good idea of what it's like to be a bat. And there are people who put on wingsuits that look like bats, right? And then they jump off mountains and buildings and they go soaring about. And to me, those look like human bats. And so those people have a pretty good idea of what it's like to fly. I don't, but somebody does. So again, it comes back to my ideas of continuity, that there are more similarities than differences. Things like, okay, well, they have sonar. Okay, yeah, well, so do some people. Some people have, especially blind people, have the ability to construct an image of the room that they're in just by the sounds.
Yeah.
Okay,
Yeah.
this is not fundamentally different than what bats are doing.
I guess in favor of Nagel, I don't think that he would. I don't know. Have you ever talked with him?
No.
No, because I don't know how deeply he would actually disagree with these things. The reason I say that is that, first of all, the point of if humans behave like bats, or if we use echolocation, we will know what it's like to be echolocation. I don't think that is so relevant, because he wasn't saying that it wasn't about bats fundamentally. It was about the question of what can physiology tell us about experience.
Right.
And secondly, if I'm not saying this would be Nagel's response, but what might be Nagel's response was that he wasn't trying to, I think, as such, to prevent people like you getting funding, which he has, I think, well, perhaps unintentionally.
Yeah.
But what he was trying to do was to say that when people say that consciousness equals the brain, or the mind equals the brain, we don't really even know what that would mean. I mean, in that paper, he says that saying that the mind is the same as the brain is like telling an ancient Greek that energy and matter are the same thing. Like they just don't have the apparatus to really even understand that. And one of the ways that he was trying to get to that intuition was that if we would know nothing about the internal life of something, just looking at the objective physiology wouldn't be able to get us there. And what you're doing, I think, is using this like, well, we know what it's like to be in love. And when we are in love, our caudate nucleus or whatever has this strong reward response. Therefore, we can guess pretty well that the same is happening with dogs, because there is this what you call functional homology. So I could see there being a place of being kind of metaphysically a Nagelian while practically a Bernsian about
Right.
this issue, if you see what I'm saying.
I do. And so philosophers have a word that if anyone uses, I pretty much get up out of I leave the room, and that's qualia.
Yes.
It's a term I despise,
Yes.
because it's a term that philosophers hide behind. It's like, okay, well, you can't know what, my experience of the color red is. Is it the same as yours? I really dislike that term because it's not, it's hiding for a reasonable question that I believe that we can probably approach answers to scientifically, and in some cases, like the perception of color, in a reductionist way. To be honest, it's not, visual perception is probably the thing that we know the best about the brain.
Hmm. 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 Well, leaving Nagel aside, let's get back to the dogs for a moment. So I've talked with Helen Fisher about the neurobiology of love in humans. And I think that when she and her team scanned people in love looking at their partners, I think that the areas lighting up were pretty much the same as the
Right.
areas lighting up in your dogs when they were was it whether it was smelling or looking at or getting praise from their owners. So as you said earlier, it doesn't mean that they are in love. There are other things that can also trigger the same response, but it probably tells us something.
Yes.
Yeah. How familiar are you with Jaak Panksepp's works? I mean, you mentioned his work in the book because he's very much in the camp of like there are these universal, at least in mammals, these emotions that run through that, you can find them in the brain.
Right.
And then there are folks like Lisa Feldman Barrett who seems to completely disagree. And it's quite difficult to get through that literature. My intuition, as I probably already said, is more on the Panksepp camp about this. But it is just an intuition. I mean, who am I to tell? Well, can you
Yeah.
help me a little bit? What do you make when you have two people who are so well informed, who've done so many convincing studies, and they just saying the complete opposite things? I mean, what's going on there?
Yeah, no, that's a good question. I am very familiar with Panksepp's work, and he was quite polarizing through his career, and probably the majority of neuroscientists and psychologists just disagreed with him, and I think he was probably marginalized more than he should have been for a variety of reasons.
Why? Why
Part of it was his personality, to be honest. I mean, he was kind of pugnacious himself and what,
Hmm.
willing to pick fights. And so he was reductionist in the extreme, right? So, his view of animal emotions was literally, okay, there's this circuit in the rat's brain that is associated with rage, and then there's this other circuit
Hmm.
that is associated with maternal behavior, and that's what it is. Um, and then you mentioned Lisa Barrett. She basically says, well, it all depends on language. You can't have happiness if you don't have a word for it.
But then babies
Uh,
couldn't be happy.
exactly, right. Um,
Which is, for me, it's a pretty serious point. I mean, the word loses a lot of its meaning if we cannot meaningfully say
yeah,
that a baby could be happy.
right. So my view of this, I mean, I think language is a bit of a red herring in much of these debates, because um, I have emotions for which I use words, but they're not very good descriptors of how I feel.
Yeah,
They're
yeah.
shorthands for it. So I might have an anxiety for a very specific thing that's different than an anxiety that I have for something else. So, for example, anxiety I might feel in a social situation is distinct from something else that might cause me to be anxious. And I don't really have the right words to describe it, but I can recognize the signature inside myself as distinct states, um, without having the words for them.
Yeah.
And I think that's probably true of all animals. They don't necessarily have exactly the same emotions that we do, because so many of our emotions are related to our sociocultural embedding, right? Which is going to be different. But a dog or any animal is going to have a suite of emotions that they recognize, to the extent that they're self-conscious and self-aware, as that thing,
Hmm.
even though they don't have the words for it.
Yeah, and this is why in our earlier discussion I mentioned, you asked me about Finnish word for emotion and feeling, and I said that I find it helpful in the Finnish language that you don't have a specific word for emotion except for the imported emotion, literally emotio, which nobody uses. Because what happens here sometimes that people are like, oh well, yeah, you can have feelings, of course, without language, but they only become emotions when you have a linguistic label on it. But then that just it feels a little artificial to me, and
Right.
almost circular. I mean, if that's how you define emotions, well, obviously you're always going to find that answer about it. But
Well, only one small camp defines emotions that way presently.
What's the camp? Just for curiosity, when you say one camp,
Well, the Lisa Barrett camp.
well, so you would say that's a small camp.
I think so.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
But okay, so one last point on emotions. I think the way to think about emotions is okay, they're not a reflex. So it's useful to distinguish, well, what's a reflex? So a reflex is a change that happens in the body that causes a predefined behavioral action or motor response. Whereas an emotion is not that specific. It's a state change that kind of generally orients you to do some types of things, but it's not a one for one.
Yeah.
So when you're hungry, and I actually would put hunger as an emotion. I think it meets many of the same requirements, and it's helpful for this discussion, right? So when you're hungry, that kind of orients you to seek food, but it doesn't trigger a program for that.
Yeah.
It just reorients your priorities.
Yeah. It prepares you to be motivated and ready to seek food. The hunger is an interesting addition because one of the things I mean, you're a pioneer in using fMRI on animals, especially animals what they're by their own choice, so to speak, who have the chance of just leaving and who are not sedated. But I don't know if this was the first study, but a very early study that I learned from your book was done with actually not a mammal but a bird in the 90s. There was this PET scan that was done with crows,
Yeah.
who had been taken from the wild and then reared. And there were so many layers. It was just a fascinating study because there were so many layers on this. I guess the two main layers, one of them was to test whether crows recognize faces well. And they did, because the people who took them had one kind of masks when they kind of abducted them, so to speak, and another kind of mask when they were taking care of them in the bird sanctuary or the lab or whatever it was. And first of all, so then when shown these masks, was it correct that the crows, they responded very differently to these masks? So they clearly had a pretty good facial perception. But what was the second layer that was really fascinating was that they had in these PET scans, which, does anybody use PET scans, by the way, anymore? Or is it a completely outdated technology?
Only for things like you're talking about.
Okay, yeah, because it's a pretty wide, when you just read about it, it's like radioactive substance to the blood and then antimatter forming positrons. I mean, it sounds pretty wild, you know.
There's clinical uses of it, primarily, for cancer treatment.
Okay. Yeah. But anyway, back to the study. So the first level was, okay, crows, they recognize faces pretty well, so they're clearly tuned to faces in a way that they're not tuned to some other objects. But then secondly, they had in these PET scans things that, by analogy to, I don't know if it was human brains or to other bird brains or whatever, but yeah, this looks like there's a fear response towards these faces that the abductors used. And then there was this attachment or some kind of positive reward attachment reaction to the faces that were taking care of them. Am I paraphrasing it correctly?
Yeah, I believe so.
And that was a fascinating study in that it was in such an early days. I mean, so like 2 decades before the dog project started. And that for me was, well, again, what language we want to use is, I guess, our choice, but that's a pretty clear indication that it makes sense. These crows don't like a face that just took them out of the wild, but they like the face that is now taking care of them. And yeah, we need some language to talk about that if we want to have any respect for the crow.
Right. So this kind of gets back to where we started this conversation, which is, how are humans supposed to use this information? One possibility is become a vegan and don't consume any animal products. I'm not vegan or even really vegetarian. I would call myself a meat minimizer, or as some people would call it, reducitarian. And my primary issue with veganism and vegetarianism is the kind of almost religious ascetic element to it, where if you consume one animal product, then does that mean you're not a vegan anymore, right? It's so absolute in many people's minds that it becomes untenable. And to me, the issue then is more, one of animal welfare, which is, okay, how do we treat animals even if we're going to eat them? Certainly in the US, most cattle end up on feedlots before they're slaughtered. And that's horrible. And it's something that I've certainly gained a much more nuanced appreciation for since moving to the country and living on a farm.
Mm.
Um, Last week, I spent several days on a cattle farm here in South Georgia, where they use the cattle to regenerate the land, recycle carbon. Ultimately, they're turned into steak and hamburger, and it's done as humanely as possible.
Mm.
Although they're very upfront, it's like, we would be disingenuous to say that there's no pain, because we can't say that.
Yeah.
And so these are hard questions. I don't have the answer to that, but I do know, that there are better ways to do this, and there are worse ways to do
Yeah.
it.
Yeah. I don't want to take a stance on veganism or vegetarianism here as such, but one of the points you mentioned earlier is this question of, well, why is there anything special about a dog? Your response was, well, not necessarily. I mean, and you say this as a dog lover, but there's two questions. One is, some people would say that yes, there is.
Well, I'm going to back you up. I'm
Okay.
going to push back on you. Why do you not want to take a stance on vegetarianism or veganism? Because I always am asked about it.
I don't want to lose half of my listeners. I think, well, no, it's a good question. I think we fall on pretty similar lines. So I'm also a meat minimalist, but I do eat it.
Yeah.
And but the other aspect of this is that I'm not a big fan of milk products either. I think my primary concern is with mammal products overall, and mammalian welfare. And I have my own reasons for this. I don't want to prescribe this as things that other people should do. That is my own take on this. I guess the reason I don't want to take a strong stance is that it's so different from people at different socioeconomic situations, from different social niches, with different intuitions, with different pets. I mean, I don't think there's a one size fits all, but I do have a lot of respect for my friends who are vegetarian or vegan and strictly so. It just doesn't chime with my personality to be strictly so. If somebody offers me food, I eat it.
Yeah.
No, thanks for pressing me. I appreciate it.
No, you're not getting off the hook. I've never let off the hook.
But I think the broad theme here is that now I laid my cards down, which is that I am a speciesist. So I'm not a speciesist in the sense that I think that only humans matter and nobody else matters, nor that only humans and dogs matter and nobody else matters. But I think that, I mean, anybody who's had a stomach worm will have to be a species to some extent and be like, I value my own health more than this bloody worm. And I think that even if you're one person who doesn't kill mosquitoes, you probably don't judge your friends as harshly if they slap a mosquito than if they would just slap a kid on the street, even if the kid wouldn't die from the slap, and the mosquito does. And so where do we draw lines? I personally would take a pretty gradualist approach. I don't think we really know. And I appreciate there was one quote in your book that I don't remember who it was from, but somebody said that it is impossible for us to have a completely consistent approach to animals in general.
Yeah. Right.
And,
that's probably Hal Herzog said that. Yeah.
But I did want to get back to the point about dogs not being special, because they don't come to the owner just for food. At least the majority of them clearly have this relationship based on the neuroimaging data. There is something more than that. There is some kind of, if not love, then some kind of very strong bond, some affection. I would be ready to call it love. I don't know if cows have it. Maybe they do, but not all animals have it. I mean, for example, do you think a lizard would have a strong affectionate response to the smell of their owner?
I don't. And my wife has lizards.
My parents have lizard, and it's great fun to play with the lizard, but the lizard doesn't really care. And I'm not saying this means that the lizard is a worse animal in some way. I'm saying that it's a different kind of relationship that human can have with a lizard than that they can have with a dog.
Right. I think, there's likely to be a lot more commonalities in mammals, obviously, because of the shared physiology and the shared maternal bond that's necessary to be called a mammal.
Exactly. Yeah.
Um, and then most mammals live in some kind of community.
Yeah.
Some are loners, but
And even the ones who are loners, they weren't loners when they were born, as you
that
would.
is that's true. That's true. If you accept our previous definition of emotions, that it's kind of a state change that orients you or the animal to some particular suite of behaviors, then yeah, I mean, I think it's reasonable to posit that many mammals, maybe all, have something like love.
Mm.
I can tell you with cows, now having spent a fair bit of time around them and talked to other cattlemen, they do form bonds. They form bonds with each other and they form bonds with their humans and they differentiate them. There have even been a few studies of cattle being able to recognize pictures
Mm.
of herd mates from those who are not herd mates and people they know from people they don't know.
Mm.
And in large enough herds, they form friendships. They have cliques. So there is clearly something going
Yeah.
on
Yeah.
there.
I guess I really want to emphasize that when I say that there may be something very special about dogs, I'm not saying it in the sense that we should play God and say that there is a hierarchy of species and dogs are at the apex. I'm saying it in a way that us and other animal species, when we build relationships to other animals, it will be a different relationships to a dog than to a wolf
Right.
for various reasons. And that doesn't mean that the dog is a better animal, but it means I will treat the dog differently. There will be a different relationship, and that will probably end up being a more loving relationship
Yeah.
and less an eating relationship. Not that I would be eating the wolf as
Right.
my primary choice either.
Although I do think dogs are promiscuous. They're easy. They will love anyone. They're not
Yes,
particularly
yes. Well, that's part of the charm. Yeah, yeah,
yeah.
yeah. Well, wonderful. Can I ask you a couple of quick questions that came up in the community when I asked if any of the listeners
Of course.
are interested in asking something. One is about brains of ants and other social insects. Do we know anything about why they are able to operate us with this incredible hive intelligence while having such small brains?
That is a great question, and I have no useful knowledge about insects.
I was
Uh,
worried this would be the answer.
yeah, so I do not feel qualified to weigh in on that.
What about really rapid learning in short-lived species? So, for the question was specifically about a rabbit that
Mhm.
in the first year is able to be trained all sorts of tricks that humans are not. The rabbit after in a 1 year can be potty trained. Clearly not genetically programmed, and not something that's easy to do with a human kid that's supposed to be much smarter. Why are some animals so much faster at learning at a very very fast pace, and then they die out much faster?
Yeah, I think, I mean, again, I'm speculating here that probably the mechanisms of learning evolved independently of the lifespan of that particular animal. So they probably represent basic learning mechanisms that exist in all animals, certainly all animals, even down to a single-celled protozoa has the
Mm.
ability to learn something about the environment. The mechanisms might be different. They might be simple, like chemotaxis, but certainly any animal with a brain can learn. That's, I would argue is one of the basic reasons the
Yeah.
brain exists is to adapt and learn about a dynamic environment. So the speed at which that happens is going to depend on, probably two factors. One is how rapidly is that animal's environment changing? So if it's a rapidly changing environment, then the evolutionary pressure would be to evolve mechanisms that can learn rapidly.
Mm.
Whereas if it's not changing rapidly, then you can use much longer term learning
But
mechanisms.
let's flip the question around and ask, why do human children learn many things so slowly?
Oh, well, I mean, I think it depends on what you're asking them to learn.
Yes, exactly. But what is the neural explanation for our very slow maturation, and why would evolution have designed us that way?
Well, I think so. Okay, so humans have both short-term, very rapidly changing things they have to learn about. So an infant comes hardwired, to suckle. That's not learned. That's a hardwired response. They know how to get milk right away. The other things then they have to learn about immediately would have to do with their changing environment. And that probably happens on, minutes to hours to day time scale. And then there are other things that don't come online that they have to learn about until much later. And that would have to do with things like knowledge and language and social nuances. So the difference between humans and, say, a chicken or a rabbit is not that we can't learn things quickly, because of course we can. We have one-shot learning. Food aversion is one-shot learning. And my dog is telling me that we're out of time pretty soon. So it's just that we have layers and layers of learning on top of the basic ones.
Yeah. Okay, one last one, not necessarily about animals as such, maybe harking more back to our conversation about selfhood identity. Will we ever find seat of consciousness? And is the claustrum the seat of consciousness? This was the Koch crick, the conductor of consciousness was supposed to be the claustrum. Yeah. Will we find one? Is there one? And is the claustrum?
Well, I mean, okay, the brainstem, if anything, is probably the seat of consciousness, because if your brainstem's not functioning, you're unconscious. Whereas if you take out someone's claustrum, I'm not sure that's the case.
Yeah, it's not the case. It does, as I just checked it before in order to be able to ask this question, it does correlate with loss of consciousness, but it doesn't mean that you're unconscious for it.
Right. And, I usually stay away from discussions of consciousness. But I will point out that consciousness is also a continuum, that we each go through different levels of consciousness on a daily basis. So when you are asleep, you have a decreased level of consciousness. You're not unconscious, but you're not fully aware of your surroundings either. So it's kind of in that middle state.
Yeah. So would that be kind of an integrated information theory view, where you can almost give like an index on how much integrated information there is in the brain, and that's the index of your level of consciousness?
Like a Tononi type of metric.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, I mean, that's as good as any. I don't believe there's a seat of consciousness. The brainstem is not the seat of consciousness, but it's like a gate.
Yeah. I think we really have to start wrapping up.
It'll stop in a moment.
Okay, great. Was there anything you would have wanted to talk about that we haven't?
Oh gosh, no, we covered so much.
We covered a lot, yeah. Having studied the human brain, having studied various other brains, and clearly having a lot of faith in there being a lot of similarities between our brains and others. Nevertheless, we are humans, we're not dogs, we're not cows. What kind of animals are we?
Humans obviously have kind of the curse of self-awareness. So dogs and cows and all the other animals we've talked about have a self-awareness, certainly in at least a physical sense. They know how their body exists. They know where their body stops and the environment begins. The human animal goes beyond that, because as far as we can tell, we're the only animals that can think of ourselves in the past, present, and future. So these alternative versions that can do time shifting. So that's a pretty unique skill set that, of course, results in the curse of the knowledge of our own mortality, that, we'll exist in the future and then we won't exist. So that's the kind of animal we are. We are a time-shifting animal.
Professor Gregory Berns, thank you very much.
Thanks, Ilari. Really appreciate it.
And thank you for staying with us until the very end. Today I thought of ending the podcast a bit differently than usual, so instead of asking you to consider sharing on Humans Forwards, I will share something with you instead. As the conversation revealed, I am perhaps regrettably not a dedicated vegan, but neither do I think that we can go on like this. So I'm always on the lookout for alternative sources of protein, iron, etc. Now, many of you might have heard about insect-based foods, crickets, etc. as a food for the future, and the emphasis here being on future and not present. And that's what I used to think too. But last week I tasted, for the first time, a genuinely delicious cricket-based minced meat. It was really gourmet level stuff in a local restaurant. And it had none of that weird insect taste that I used to dislike in these products. And I really, really hope that this trend will grow. So if you're someone like me who wants to move away from eating mammals and birds, but is still happy to consume animal products such as these, please do consider checking your local offering. The company I tried was called Yum Bug. You can check the link in the show notes. It's a London-based company shipping to households and restaurants UK-wide. But I'm sure that there are other pioneers in other countries that have been able to reach remarkable heights in terms of taste and quality. And by the way, this is no paid advertisement. I don't even know anyone at the company. You can consider it a tip from a friend. But that's all for now. Thank you as always for listening. Take care.